So fall is upon us, and I don't know about you, but fall is my favorite time of year. I love watching the plants turn their fall colors, going out for a hike, or just spending time in the garden and watching the leaves turn. But it also means the time to put in your bulbs. And I think I'm just excited about fall is squirrels are about you planting your bulbs. So we'll talk about squirrels a little bit later on as well. But it is the time of year when we start seeing the bulbs show up in the stores. Usually beginning of September, mid-September, you're seeing a lot of them out. And now's the time to start thinking about planting them. But you've got a couple months yet to get them into the ground. But you might want to shop while the selection is still really great. So today we'd like to go through some of the pointers in that. How to plant them, where to plant them, how to keep those squirrels away from your bulbs. And so we'll go through some of that information today. First thing of all is just kind of explaining what a bulb is. If you're new to gardening or maybe you've never gardened with bulbs and that, is there's kind of two families of bulbs. We talk about fall bulbs and summer bulbs. And the fall bulbs are what you'll see in the stores right now, so they're the ones you plant in the fall. But there'll be the ones like the tulips, daffodils, crocus, grape hyacinths, all those ones that will come out and bloom in the spring. The summer bulbs are the ones you actually plant in the spring, and they don't survive the winters outside. So your dahlias, your begonias, canna lilies, gladiolas, those bulbs you'll see for sale in the stores in the spring, and you plant them then and they'll bloom later into the summer months. So kind of two family of bulbs. But what's interesting about a bulb is that inside this little bulb is everything that it needs to set roots, to grow, and to blossom. And it's always contained within inside the bulb. And we'll get into a little bit of the science of that as well. So it is kind of a fascinating thing when you get into it and get to understand how the bulbs grow. And it also will help you understand then how to keep care of your bulbs, what to do when. And that will make sense a bit later on as well. So there are different types of bulbs. This is what we call a true bulb. This is a daffodil bulb. So you kind of think of that true onion shape, and that's what they refer to as a true bulb. But there's other ones you'll recognize as well. Rhizomes, we think of irises or canna lilies that will have more of a longer root system to it. There's corms, and they're the ones that think of crocus that you'd be planting now, that they look like squished down little bulbs. Gladiolas are also the same, so they call those corms. So there is different types of bulbs, but basically they all get the same care. So we'll be kind of covering all the fall bulbs today and how to care for them. So the first thing is when you go to the garden center, to the store, and you're looking for bulbs, what is it that you need to be looking at? And the first thing is you want to see, sometimes you'll buy the bulbs just in a bulk crate, or sometimes they'll be pre-packaged like what you can see here in front of me. But kind of check out the bulbs. Do they look really marked up? Do they look bruised? Are the gouges cut out of them? And also even through the package, just feel the bulb and see if the bulb is firm to the touch. If they're really spongy, you're not wanting to buy those. So that's the first thing, is look at what shape it is in. All the bulbs come with a papery kind of tunic layer. And if it's slight, some of the layers are missing that's not so important. But you definitely don't want anything where you can see there's a gouge, because quite often that's where fungus or that will start to grow onto it. So just make sure the bulb's looking in great shape. The next thing you want to be checking on is the size of the bulb. And you'll see if you go from store to store, you'll see all different price ranges. You think, well, how come their tulips are so much cheaper than somebody else's tulips? And it's usually because of the size of the bulb. The bigger the bulb is, the quicker it will come into bloom and the larger the blooms will be. So if you're buying smaller bulbs, it's because they're more immature. And if you've ever watched a bulb grow, you'll know that there's little bulbs that will come off of the main bulb. I'll call them little baby bulbs off the mother bulb. And if you're buying smaller ones, you're just buying one that has been separated from its mother. And it doesn't really have the capacity yet to bloom. So if you have bought bulbs smaller in size, and then the next year wondered why you didn't get very many flowers, that's the main reason why, is it takes a few years for that bulb to mature enough to set that flower bud. So just because you're thinking, oh, you're getting ones that are a bit cheaper, so that's great, you may be waiting a couple years for them to come into bloom. So always check out the size of the bulb and make sure that it's in good shape. Hopefully where they're storing the bulbs at the store, they're either outside where it's a bit cooler and haven't been in the heat too long either. So a couple things that you can be checking out. In the package, some of them come with a bit of a wood shavings or material in there, and that's just to keep the bulbs dry. So not a bad thing that comes in them, but if they don't, yeah, you can just be feeling how firm that bulb is. Also, when you're starting to shop for the bulbs, consider the bloom time. So on most of the packages, or even on the bulk ones that are in crates, they'll have good signage on there for you. And just be reading up saying, they usually call it late, mid, or early spring. And so just kind of check the bloom time. It's nice to have staggered. But the bulbs offer at this time of year, planting them, is that it elongates your spring in the garden. You start getting flowers earlier than you would with your perennials or shrubs. And so make sure you have some staggered bloom times. If they all bloom at once, then the whole show is done. And but if you get some early flowering bulbs, usually your smaller bulbs like your crocus, snowdrops, grape hyacinths bloom first. So if you get a mixture of that, maybe some tulips, even the tulips you can get an early, mid, or late tulip, and then the daffodils as well. So if you stagger your times, then you'll just get a longer show in the garden. They'll usually still overlap a bit, so you'll still get your crocus in bloom when your daffodils come out. But look for your bloom time, and also be checking on the packages for your heights. Not all tulips grow the same height, not all daffodils grow the same height. So kind of think about your garden, where you're going to be planting them. Maybe some bulbs you're going to be putting in behind some lower shrubs in the garden. So you do need them to get to be at a height. So maybe it's something more like the giant alliums that has the large purple flowers on it. Maybe it's more like the daffodils or a taller tulip. A lot of times I'll see that they've put the crocus or the grape hyacinths in behind regular hyacinths or tulips, and then they just get lost in the garden. So kind of really be thinking it out, or even draw a little bit of a map before you go shopping and say, well, I need something taller here, I need something middle size here, I need something lower here. And it'll just help you to remind you when you're in the store looking, saying, do I have those staggered times? And do I have the staggered heights that will work in between the different shrubs? So those are the things that you should be looking for when you're starting to shop for bulbs. So the next thing we're going to talk about is how and when to plant the bulbs. And as I said, most of the bulbs will start appearing in the stores in early September to mid-September. And it's probably your best time for buying it. If you wait too late, then you're kind of restricted. Some varieties will have run out by then, and you're kind of getting the leftovers. So definitely be shopping early. But really the best time to be planting them is, I would say, mid-October to mid-November, planting them even a little bit later. If we go into a really warm fall and you plant really early, the bulb might actually start to grow before winter time. But if you can keep the bulbs cool and before you plant, and wait till about mid-October, I know people that have very successfully planted them in December if we've had a really warm fall. And it's great to be putting it in the ground at that time. Also gives the squirrels less time to find them on you before the ground freezes up. So another great way to do that as well. So, but be shopping now. When you're buying bulbs, make sure they're either if they're in more of a plastic bag, that there's perforations in the bag. This one has holes all throughout, so it's still allowing the air to get in, and it's not allowing the moisture to collect up on there. So either if they're in plastic, make sure there's air holes for it, or just storing them into a paper bag or a cardboard box, keeping them in a cooler place until you're ready to plant. So that might be into a fruit cellar in the basement, or even if your garage doesn't see a lot of sunlight, and put it on the cement floor where it feels cooler. That will keep them long enough till you're ready to plant. And but yeah, wait till about mid-October, mid-November to start putting them in the ground. The bulbs really do need a well-drained soil. They don't like wet soil, so if you have a lot of heavy clay, you're definitely wanting to amend that soil before you start planting. So you can be adding in a triple mix that already has the peat moss, manure, and topsoil mixed together, or maybe you're just adding sheep or cattle manure into it that's been composted. And that's just going to break up that clay soil and help improve the drainage, or mound up the area. So if it's kind of a flat bed area and you're putting them in, even just raise up with some good soil so that there's good drainage away from the bulbs. I've known some people that's tried planting them in the swales, in those ditches that are along the back of newer properties, and quite often they'll come back and say none of them came up, and they're really disappointed. And we usually blame the squirrels, but those are usually damp areas, and the bulbs will just rot because they are more of a fleshy organism in that, so they'll usually rot in a wet soil. So make sure there's great drainage. If you have raised gardens, that's great, and we'll be talking a bit later on about doing them in containers as well for the winter. So make sure amend the soil, get some nutrients back into the soil, and just improve that drainage by doing so. So make sure you're doing some amendment before you're planting. Even if you're planting in between existing shrubs and that, you can still be adding a bit of that compost into there, or when you dig the hole to plant itself, just make sure you're mixing that clay soil that you dug out of the hole, mixing it in with some good draining soil. Anything that you can do to help them. That's the main problem that you might run into is just bad drainage around the bulbs, and you just won't see them the next year. Most bulbs, like a place that is in full sun, there's a few that are more naturalizing bulbs. There's the little blue scillas that you see in the spring, kind of works well in a woodland garden and that. But the majority of the bulbs do like a sunny spot. But it doesn't mean that you can't plant under trees. They just need the sun while they're up and growing. So a lot of times the trees really aren't in leaf yet while the bulbs are up and blooming and the leaves are still green. So if it's an area that gets sunlight from that April till mid-May time, and maybe it doesn't shade over till later in the season when all the trees fill out, bulbs can still work into that site. So just don't think, oh, I've got a shady corner. Think about it in the spring and how much sun do you get? Is it a deciduous tree that's causing the shade? And those can still work into those areas. So there's a lot of room in our yards to add the bulbs in to extend that length of time of blooms in the spring. And we are all, by March and April, we're all itching to see some color come into our garden. So make sure you can find a sunny spot to put them into. When you're planting the bulbs in that, a lot of people, you'll see the little bulb planters, and they're cute and shiny and very nice. But if you're just planting one bulb here, one bulb there, you're not going to be very pleased with it. The bulbs do multiply, some quicker than others, but it's going to take a long time for it to be a nice show of color. So what I would recommend when you're planting is to dig a larger hole and then put a grouping of the bulbs into there. So maybe you're doing like 5 or 7 daffodils in one clump together. The larger the garden area is, the larger of grouping you should have. And also the further away that you're viewing it. Maybe your house is set back a long way from the street, and so 2 daffodils on its own aren't really going to show from the streets. So you might have to do like a grouping of 9 or 11. We always do things in odd numbers in landscaping, but do larger groupings if you're viewing it from a distance. Or maybe you're planting some nice tulips in the back corner of your yard, but you've got 100 feet between the house and your yard, and then the back corner. So again, do larger groupings in those areas, just so that you can enjoy the show and the color when they do come out. So don't be spacing them too far apart. They're all different as far as spacing goes, and that's usually outlined on the label for you, how far apart to space them. But dig one hole, amend all that soil, and when you're planting them as well and starting to put the grouping in the hole together, just make sure that the bulbs aren't going to be touching each other. You can probably go a little bit closer than what it recommends, especially if you're impatient, and depending. So daffodils, I would usually do almost a hand width in between them, but you don't want them to be touching each other because that's going to cause rotting in there, and you need space for them to multiply in that as well while they're in the ground. So do that large grouping, you've got the soil amended, and then you want to put some fertilizer in the hole with the bulb itself. I always like using the organic fertilizers. So you can get the bone meal, and bone meal is very high in phosphorus, high in that middle number. And that's what you're looking at for bulb food. There's other ones. This is a super green product that we have out here. And if you look at the 3 numbers, you're looking at 296. So the 9 is the phosphorus. And it's the phosphorus that's going to help the root growth. And in the fall, that's what you're really concerned about. It's just getting the root system established before winter hits. The more roots it can get out and get going, the stronger it will perform for you when it comes spring. So also be putting a fertilizer, and most of them are pellet form that you can just shake some in the hole as you go. And you can even put some on the soil after you're done planting. So one thing you want to be adding in with your soil amendments when you're shopping for bulbs, make sure you've got something that's going to give you higher phosphorus. Usually with planting, I always say green side up. Bulbs are a bit more confusing. But both bulbs, usually it's pointed end up. So on the daffodil here, tulips are very similar. Most of them, there's a definite bottom. You might even see some of the old roots still on the bulb, and that's fine to leave them there. These roots don't come back to life, but it'll send out new roots from the bulb itself. But always do kind of pointed end up is always a good basic rule. There's some bulbs you'll get, like anemones and that look like a large raisin. And you think, well, can you tell which end is up? I let them worry about that themselves. Just put them in there, space them out according to this thing, and they'll definitely grow the way they should go. So some bulbs are harder to tell, but if there's actually a pointy end and a roundy end, then make sure you're doing pointed end up. But the bulb will figure it out in time anyway. And so space them out nicely into there. Make sure that they're all pointing in the right direction, not touching each other. And another thing when you're planting then is, don't just ram the soil on top, but just kind of gently start filling the soil back into the hole and kind of compacting it a little bit as you go. And make sure you're giving them a good deep soaking once they're into the ground. That water will just kind of bring moisture back into the bulb because the ones you're buying have been out of the ground for several months. So just giving that water to them will encourage the roots to start growing into the ground as well. So just some helpful hints there when you're planting your bulbs. When you're planting your bulb, if it comes with a package, again for spacing, we said go by what the package is recommending. And also it'll tell you the depth to plant the bulb. Maybe you've dug up bulbs from someplace in your garden, or somebody's given you some, or you bought the bulb in a bulk form and you didn't get the label. A general rule for depth of planting the bulb is go at least 3 times as wide as the diameter of the bulb itself. So a daffodil bulb you might be looking at up to 2 inches in diameter, so you'd be planting them 6 inches deep. If you're looking at crocus and grape hyacinths, scillas, the little blue flowering ones and that, they're very tiny bulbs, say 1 inch in diameter at the most, so you're planting those about 3 inches deep. So again, just another basic rule of thumb, if you don't know the planting depth or where you should be putting them, that go about 3 times the width of the bulb itself. You can always be planting a little bit deeper than that. It's just going to take them longer to come up. And when you think about it, the first thing that comes up in the spring is always the smallest bulbs. The snowdrops is usually the first thing we see, the scillas, the grape hyacinths, the dwarf irises, the little blue or yellow dwarf irises. And those are the ones that are planted closest to the surface. So what happens in the spring, the sun starts warming up the ground, and it's going to warm up the top of the ground first, so those bulbs will start growing earliest. And as you get bigger bulbs, if you're planting like those giant alliums with the large globe purple flowers onto it, those bulbs can up to be about 3 inches in diameter. So you're going down at least 8-9 inches in depth, and they don't usually come up till June. So as your soil heats up, it activates those bulbs that are closest to the surface first and kind of works its way down. So a great thing to do in the garden, and we'll kind of demonstrate that with a container later on, is even just not doing one type of bulb in one area, but kind of layering them up. So if you wanted your pink tulips to come up, there's no reason why you couldn't plant your tulips down to 6 inches deep, put a little bit of soil on top, and then do a layer of crocus on top of that soil. And then again, they'd be about 3 inches deep, and then fill up with soil. So your crocus would come up first through there and start giving you blooms in that area, and then your tulips will soon follow along. Eventually you might have to thin out the bulbs as they multiply year after year, just to give them space to continue to grow like that. But there's no reason why you can't be mixing the bulbs and having one set of blooms come and then another set of blooms. And again, just getting as much show of color in that one spot as you can, and enjoy the spring with all your colors coming up. So be thinking about it that way. And if you're thinking, well, I don't know what's early and what's mid and what's late flowering, your smallest bulbs are all going to be early flowering. And your biggest bulbs, like the alliums, are going to be a much later one. So it also helps you gauge your flowering times in that as well. But there's no reason why you can't be layering up and getting more than one type of bulb coming up in that little square foot of space that you have for color. So once you've got the soil filled up and you've given your bulbs a good water, they're basically set for the fall. I like to put a bit of mulch over top. First of all, I think it discourages the squirrels a little bit, or even if you're raking up leaves and that, or shred some leaves with a lawnmower, even throwing that over top, it actually keeps that area moist. But I think it deters the squirrels can't smell the bulbs as quickly either, with the smell of the leaves decaying and that as well in those areas. But basically they're set to go. And as I said, inside a bulb is everything the bulb needs to grow. And when you look at if you think of cutting an onion down in half this way, so vertically, what you'll see if you're cutting up your onion, you'll see that corky area in the center. And usually as you're slicing up your onion, that kind of flies out and doesn't cut up as well. That's actually your flower bud waiting to come out. And we all know that the onions, and if you cut into a daffodil or tulip, you're going to see the same thing, is that there's rings around that center piece. and each ring is actually a leaf. And you'll see those coming out next. At the bottom of the bulb, we always know by the rounded end, you'll see a basal plate. And that's the flat area, and that's where the roots will come out. So all that is sitting inside the bulb ready to go. And that's when I said when you're purchasing bulbs, make sure you're purchasing a bit larger size, especially if you want a good show the first year, because that's already set to go. So once you got them planted in the ground, good soil around it, you've put some fertilizer on there as well, they're all set. There's nothing else you need to do until after they're done their bloom in the spring. But it's important to remember that. And I also said when you're purchasing, make sure that the bulb isn't spongy. And if you think of an onion in your house or whatever, and it starts to sprout before you get it used, that bulb will usually feel spongy. And that's because those leaves that the rings of the onion are now coming out of the bulb itself, leaving the bulb empty. And it's important to understand that science of the bulb. Same thing with a potato. A potato is a tuber, which is a form of bulb. And if you have a potato in the house that's in the warm and starts to sprout, that potato also gets soft. And whatever food that's already in this bulb ready to go, in the spring when it starts to grow, all that food then is on top of the plant and nothing's left inside the bulb. And when that really becomes important is when we're caring for our bulbs in the spring, and we always want to get rid of those leaves as soon as the tulips are done blooming or the daffodils are done. We just want to cut them down and get rid of them. But really, once they come up and do their thing and they have the flowers on them, the only thing you should be pruning at that time is the actual flower stalk. At the end of the flower stalk where the flower was, it's setting seed, which is taking energy away from the bulb as well. So you want to remove that flower stalk as soon as it's done its bloom, and not just pinch the flower at the top, but remove that whole stalk down right into the leaves. But leave the leaves there, and leave them, as long as they're green, they should still be there. And I know you want to get annuals planted and they're in your way and they start looking floppy and it's kind of frustrating, and you think, oh, when are they just going to yellow? But it's until when the leaves start to yellow is when the food that's in the leaves, so all the time the leaves have been out after the flower is done, the sun's been hitting the leaves, and we remember from science class that the sun is then converted by the plant into chlorophyll. And that energy, that food that is built up in the leaves. So as long as the leaves are green, all the food for the bulb is in the leaves. When the leaves start to yellow, what's happening is that chlorophyll is moving from the leaves back into the bulb, and it's actually what will firm up your bulb, and it's at that time that the flower bud is set or not set for the following season. So the longer you can leave the leaves there and just let them go naturally yellow, the better blooms you'll have the next season. If you're Martha Stewart or that, you could braid them, put them into a little ponytail, whatever you like to do. But when you understand that science, and you think, oh, the flowers weren't as nice as last year, and the first question I'll always ask you is, did you leave the leaves to yellow? And it's like, oh no, I got rid of them, and that's usually why they're not performing the way you want them to, because you've robbed the bulb of all that food. When you cut the leaves, you threw away its food, and it's not, if you dug up the bulb at that time, you'd find that the bulb is very soft, and so it hasn't set that flower bud up in the center. I remember growing up, my grandpa had a wonderful vegetable garden, and towards the end of the summer, he'd always have us as kids go out, and he grew Spanish onions bigger than I've ever seen. And he would always have us go out and just stamp over the top. We were just supposed to walk and just kind of crush over the top of the onions, the green tops of the onions. And I asked my mom once, why do we do that? And she said, I'm not sure, he always does that. But it was after I went through school and understood the science of how a bulb works. What he was doing was kind of causing the leaves to yellow up a bit quicker, making sure that all that food from the leaves went into the bulb. And it was making larger onions for him. He said better tasting onions as well that way. But when I started thinking about it, I was like, wow, I used to know that and I didn't even know I knew it. So just interesting how the bulb works. But a robbing of its leaves in the spring too early, and you're not going to get as good show from it. So as long as you can tolerate them, even if they're just starting to turn yellow, is much better for the bulb that way. So when you planted your bulbs, you had fertilized them at that time to help with the root system. Now we're looking in spring, they've now finished, you've cut down the leaves. So you can actually be fertilizing your bulb another time in the spring. And go again with that high phosphorus fertilizer. So this is a 296. Bone meal would be another great one to use. And at this time what it's going to do is help it set its flower buds. The phosphorus is always for root growth and flowering. So even be fertilizing once they're done, it just gives that bulb that much extra food. So as you're cutting them down, just throw some fertilizer over the soil, and that will help get them all set up for next year. People are always asking, do I need to dig up the tulip bulbs every year? They're used to the summer bulbs that you do have to dig up. But the daffodils, the whole family of fall bulbs that we're looking at, daffodils, hyacinths, tulips, alliums, they are winter hardy. They can stay in the ground for the winter months. And even the crocus and that, you think they're so small and closer to the surface, they can also stay in the ground. So if you're planting them in the fall, you don't need to be digging them up. Sometimes, especially the daffodils, they will multiply. And you might have a large patch of daffodils that over time is just not flowering as much, maybe not showing as much color. They don't seem as happy or healthy. So every so often you may have to dig up a clump and just divide out the bulbs again, that they become too tight and kind of too root bound in the area that they're in. So every few years, if you're finding that, I find it's mainly with the daffodils, that it's just kind of dwindling out. That's the time to kind of dig it up in the fall and just separate those bulbs out and get them going again. And when you see a bulb multiplying, they all kind of do it the same way. I looked for a daffodil bulb, couldn't find one that was, but if this was kind of the parent bulb that went in, you'll start seeing a bulb form on the outside that's kind of attached around the bottom of the bulb itself. And as long as it's tight against that bulb, you shouldn't be dividing that out. You think of that as a baby bulb, but think of it as when they become teenagers, the bulb will actually start pushing itself away from the mother bulb, the parent bulb, just like a teenager. And so when they start to push out like that, they're not taking up all the food from the parent bulb. They're actually starting to feed on their own. And so once they start kind of pushing away from the parent bulb, those ones can be taken off and planted if you're dividing up your bulbs at that time. But just know that those small bulbs probably won't produce flowers for the first couple of years. It has to mature before it can produce as well. But it is a great way to multiply and get, like, if you want more bulbs in different areas or that, a great way to do it. But just remove the ones that are starting to push away. You'll see that the bottom is still attached, but the bulb itself will actually push out from the parent bulb as it's growing and getting larger. And by that time, it's developed its own root system. So if you're dividing your bulbs and you're looking at them saying, well, can I divide this clump up or not? It's just a good way of telling. Once the bulbs start to push away from each other, they're ready to go on their own. You might want to plant them in with the larger bulbs, so you're still getting some flowers there the next season, and not having to wait 2 or 3 years. But just know if you get a lot of leaves the next year from these small bulbs, that's the reason. They're not mature enough yet to set that flower bud inside them. But they will come. Just leave them in the ground, and then in a year or two, they'll be producing for you.